If you're a longtime player of Bethesda games, you'll probably know that their main campaigns aren't usually the most memorable parts of those titles. And even though those main campaigns can be well written and interesting stories, usually factions are some of the most memorable and most liked part of those games. And I don't think Starfield is going to be any different. And if you're enjoying my Starfield coverage, make sure to subscribe. This channel is solely based on Starfield, and we have tons of videos coming soon. And we even recently got some new information from Jamie Mallory, who is a producer on Starfield. You may also know her as the Sandwich Thief, and she gives an idea of how expansive the faction system and the faction storylines can be. So while some may rush through the main Golden Path storyline, those intrepid explorers who venture off the beaten path and delve into the faction quests are in for a real treat. The amount of content packed into these faction storylines is truly astonishing. It's like embarking on a grand adventure within an adventure, where every choice you make and every interaction you have shapes the course of the tale. The character development, the plot twists, and the moral dilemmas. I've been completely hooked. These quests offer a chance to delve deeper into the game's rich lore and uncover hidden gems that add layers of depth and excitement to the overall experience. So for this video, I want to do a top-down overview of all of the factions we currently know of in Starfield. Then I also want to go over some factions that I also think are probably going to be in Starfield. And I've gone back and forth in how much information I want to give on all of these different factions, and I landed on giving more of a top-down overview without giving too much information as to not spoil some of that story. Because for a lot of these factions, we know quite a bit more information than I'm going to talk about in this video, and I'm even going to leave out things like the leaders of these factions, just because I think some of this information may spoil a little bit too much. So starting off, we have the main factions, and we do know all of these are going to be joinable by the playable character, but we don't know to what extent these factions are going to play in, say, the main story of the game. And starting off, we have Constellation, which you've probably heard quite a bit about. So Constellation is a legendary space exploration organization based in New Atlantis. By 2033, as the drive to explore the galaxy has waned, Constellation has become the shadow of its former glory, and few among the public are aware that it is still active. It has become known as the last group of space explorers. Constellation is dedicated to answering the question of what's out there. In their exploration, the group encountered and excavated pieces of an ancient artifact. And these ancient artifacts are also seeming to play a pretty big part in the main story of the game. And Constellation also seems to be a little bit out of the ordinary, because it seems like a faction that you'll be joining no matter what, unless they don't require you to join it for the main campaign. But as also detailed in the showcase, the main Constellation members are also going to be the main companions for the entirety of the game. So even though Constellation is a main joinable faction, it seems to have a much bigger role in the game than most of the other factions will. And then next up, we have the United Colonies. The United Colonies is the most powerful faction in Starfield, and one of the two established governments in the settled systems. It is a centralized republic with numerous member colonies across multiple star systems, and it wields humanity's strongest military force. The United Colonies' capital is the city of New Atlantis, which is on the planet of Jemison in the Alpha Centauri system. And as you could probably guess, this is going to be the strongest faction in the game, and is going to play the role as the main governmental body of the entire galaxy. And their capital of New Atlantis is also going to be the biggest city Bethesda has ever made in terms of handcrafted content. So Bethesda has also put a lot of work into the United Colonies and into their capital of New Atlantis. And then we have the Free Star Collective, which is kind of on the opposite side of the United Colonies. These two factions were actually the ones that fought in the Colony Wars, which is a pretty big war that took place previous to the events of Starfield happening. So the Free Star Collective is one of the two established governments in the settled systems. It is a libertarian confederation of 3 distinct star systems and opposes humanity's second largest military force. The capital of the Free Star Collective is Aquila City, which is on the planet of Aquila in the Cheyenne system. And besides being the second strongest faction with the second strongest military, it is also very heavily themed around that Wild West cowboy aesthetic, but this is also going to kind of play the role as the main opposing force to the United Colonies, even though they're not currently at war. And then next we have the Crimson Fleet, which is headquarters in the Key, which is a former United Colonies space station located in the Crick system. And the Crimson Fleet is not a single organized entity, but a loose confederation of individual pirate captains, all organized under the same banner. For years, the Crimson Fleet was considered a localized problem for the Free Star Collective, but in 2033, which is in the time period of the Starfield game, the pirates expanded far beyond the Crick system and established new footholds in Sagan, Cheyenne, Lunara, and Narion. This caused the United Colonies to officially recognize the Crimson Fleet as a growing threat and commit to eliminating it. So the Crimson Fleet is going to be the main pirate faction. This is also going to be one of the main factions, so you will be able to join them if you want to. And presumably, if joining them, you're going to be doing a lot of fighting against other factions such as the Free Star Collective or the United Colonies. So if you want to play as a pirate, this is probably going to be a faction you're going to want to be joining. Now, the next two factions are a little bit different. They still seem to be both classified as major factions and both seem to be joinable by the player, but we have quite a bit less information on these and they work quite a bit differently. So first off, we have Ryujin Industries. Ryujin Industries is a major corporation that offers its products throughout the settled systems. Its headquarters is in the pleasure city of Neon. And this corporation also seems to be very heavily inspired by a more cyberpunk aesthetic. Even though it is a big corporation, it still seems to be run by a criminal organization. And likewise, we also have the Xenofresh Corporation. The Xenofresh Corporation is a corporation operating in the settled systems, and this corporation constructed the pleasure city of Neon, which is also now used as Ryujin Industries' capital. And this is where a certain type of fish was discovered with psychotropic properties, and Xenofresh used this species of fish to create the popular but mostly illegal drug called Aurora. And interestingly enough, Aurora is actually legal to be used and sold on Neon. So it would make sense for multiple big corporations to have a foothold on Neon and to also have some amount of criminal elements leading them. Now, past the major factions, there also seems to be quite a lot of minor factions, and it's currently unknown if we're going to be able to join minor factions, and if we are, it's unknown which minor factions we're going to be able to join. Now, the first of these is the Ecliptic Mercenaries, and we don't have a ton of information on this, but this seems to be a highly skilled special operation mercenary organization that would probably be hired by maybe other major factions as muscle, and this is probably a minor faction you're going to end up fighting at some point, maybe sometime later in the game, because it seems like they're very skilled soldiers. Now, we do have some religious minor factions as well, and there's 3 we currently know of, and we're going to actually be interacting with these in some interesting ways because there are also 3 traits you're able to select at character creation that basically means you were raised by somebody within that religion. Now, you are only able to select one of these per character, so if you select one of them, you can't select a second one. And these 3 religious factions being the Enlightened, which is a scientific religious branch providing an alternative to the mysticism cult, which is the Sanctum Universal. The Sanctum Universal being one of the other religious factions, and the Sanctum Universal seems to be the most popular or one of the most popular religions in the entirety of Starfield, and it's also kind of been mentioned that it may be a good one to choose if you want to be a trader because of how big this religious faction is. They would have a lot of trade connections throughout the galaxy. Now, the third being the religion of the Great Serpent, and this one is pretty much completely shrouded in mystery, and it's definitely being built up more as an extreme cult, but we do know of a more specific faction within this religion called the House of Varun, but we don't know how this specific house is going to play play into the Great Serpent religion as a whole. And like I mentioned, these traits you can choose that makes you raised by someone in these different religions is also going to give you some very interesting perks, such as having access to some special resources and equipment from vendors from these religions. You're going to get additional dialogue options with other members of these religions, and then choosing one of these traits that makes you raised by that religion also disables the traits of the other religions. And like I mentioned, we don't know if you're specifically able to join these different minor factions, but with specifically looking at these 3 different religions, it very much seems like there's going to be quest lines based around them with the opportunity to join them. And then we also got to look at the Red Mile faction, which seems to be a faction of runners or potentially smugglers, and they operate off the planet Prima 3 in the Prima system. We actually got a small look of this at the most recent Starfield showcase, and this faction does seem to have some type of content based around being a runner, as they call it, and we don't actually know what this is. It did look like they had some sort of race track or obstacle course that you could take part in with the Red Mile, and if I would have to wager just a pie in the sky guess, I would probably say that this is a smuggling faction, and that this kind of a race course they have would be a way to actually join them and start smuggling for them. And as I've gone over in previous videos, smuggling seems to be a pretty big system within Starfield, so having a faction completely based around that makes complete sense. Now, one of the least mentioned factions is the Spacers, which seem to just be dangerous marauders and bandits who will prey on basically anybody they come across. This seems to be a purely enemy faction that you'll probably always fight no matter what, and it's probably just a way to give some background and story to some enemies within the game. Now, some of the factions that we have basically heard no information about, but I think are going to be in the game, are the Trade Authority, because we did get to see a dialogue option that asked about the Trade Authority. I've gone over a video on this. I think the Trade Authority is probably going to be an entity that controls and governs trade in a large portion of the game, so more of a governing body that sets the rules of legitimate and legal trade. You probably wouldn't be able to join this faction, but maybe you'll be able to accept quests or objectives from this Trade Authority. And in a similar vein to the Trade Authority, we have seen an organization called Starfreight Logistics, which is one of the companies that makes a lot of the cargo containers you can put on your ships. Now, I think there is a possibility that a corporation like this would also be a minor faction within the game, probably one you wouldn't be able to join, but similar to the Trade Authority, you might be able to pick up quests or objectives for hauling from this corporation. So it'd still play the role as a minor faction, but it would not be joinable. And I do think that there are going to be some pretty robust systems for smuggling cargo through the universe, planet to planet, and for transporting legal cargo from planet to planet as well, abiding by the rules of the Trade Authority and probably working for Starfreight Logistics. But that's pretty much all the information I could find for the different factions in Starfield, and I'm sure this is just the start. I would be very surprised if there wasn't a ton of other minor factions that are either not going to be joinable or you're going to be able to join them, and that are also most likely going to have their own quest lines, or at least objectives or quests you can pick up from them, basically the same as just picking up a job. And furthermore, as somebody that's played a lot of Bethesda's previous titles, their factions have always been one of the most interesting and most well-developed parts of their games. The main stories are usually pretty decent, but I think the factions of Bethesda games are usually the best parts. They usually have some of the most interesting stories, and their stories are usually pretty long and pretty extensive. In fact, I think Bethesda's faction storylines are usually as big as a lot of other games' main storylines are, and I think Starfield is going to be no different. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.